Second reading comes from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 7, verses 24 through 37. And we have two different healing stories here. From there, Jesus set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there, yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." And when she went home, she found the child lying on the bed and the demon gone. Then Jesus returned from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon toward the Sea of Galilee in the region of Decapolis. They brought him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. He took him aside in private, away from the crowd, and he put his fingers into his ears, and he spat, and he touched his tongue. Then, looking up at the heaven, he sighed and said, "Ephphatha," that is, "be opened." And his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one, but the more he ordered them, the more zealous they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, "He does everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Well, I don't know about you, I haven't polled you yet, but I do not find this first healing story in this text, the one with the Syrophoenician woman, I really just don't like this story. It's really tempting to skip. The interaction with this woman plainly does not portray Jesus as what I want to know him as. I want a warm, kind, friendly Jesus. I do not want a Jesus that snaps at people and puts down women just because they're not Jewish. This creates a real discord for me and maybe for you as well. In contrast, remember last Sunday, we dealt with an earlier part of the same chapter of Mark, dealt with Jesus having a confrontation with the Jewish temple leaders. It was clearly a conversation intended for Jewish community folks who understood the issue of purity codes, dealing with a dispute that their interpretation of what can defile a person or being separate the person from God, confronting about rituals around eating. You go, Jesus. Tell it to them like it is. Tell them those Pharisees what it says. I can handle that kind of confrontation. In today's part, though, of the same Mark 7 chapter, the encounter of Jesus with the Syrophoenician woman and the deaf-mute man are quite different from the earlier stories. One thing that I'd point out is they are an encounter with Gentiles, with non-Jewish people, encounters with people outside the Jewish community. We are supposed to know enough geography that when the text says, "From there he set out and went away to the region of Tyre," we know that he is going deep into Gentile territory. Tyre is a city north of Sidon on the Mediterranean coast. Actually, quite a journey by foot for Jesus and his disciples. But going back to my concern, it actually makes me feel a bit better that the commentaries that I read this in preparation about this text, they confirm that hardly any other gospel story triggers more sharp reactions than this one with the Syrophoenician woman. But yet, how are we to understand this story? Now, some interpretations just strongly object to Jesus' tone and words to the woman. They conclude that he was being rude, dismissive, and patronizing. Period. Leave it at that. Walk away. Okay. Maybe they soften it a bit by saying he was exhausted and seeking downtime from his long, arduous journey and was exhausted emotionally. Some others try to shield Jesus from such accusations, suggesting he was joking. Really? Where else do we hear Jesus joking? Yet, in Mark, the words are there for us to read. They seem clear. The options are all somewhat different readings of the story, but they share one common thing. They assume that Jesus is the one in position of authority over a defenseless and submissive woman of Tyre. This is not a totally unreasonable understanding. But yet, somehow this woman who approaches Jesus breaks through every traditional barrier that would prevent her from doing so. She is a Gentile of Syrophoenician origin. In other words, she is simply impure, one who lives outside the land of Israel and outside the law of Moses, a descendant of the ancient enemies of Israel. She's also a woman, as we read it, unaccompanied by a husband or male relative who initiates a conversation with a strange man, another taboo transgressed. If we look at it this way, this woman is an outsider, and what is more telling is Jesus actually has the nerve to say as much to her face. When the woman falls on her feet and begs him to heal her daughter, Jesus says, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." The children in this statement imply the children of Israel, and the dogs should be understood to be all other peoples. Even she is an unwanted outsider. Jesus' sharp words to her can strike me as truly unconscionable. But I want to share with you that another commentator, Leanne Van Dyke, has yet another way, a very different interpretation of this story for us to consider, one that turns the story upside down. Did you ever think about how it was that the woman got access to Jesus? Van Dyke proposes that this woman was one of the power brokers in Tyre, one of the economic and political elite, of which there were some women. Under Roman occupation, Tyre's leaders acted as political pawns to extract goods and services from the region further south being where the poor Jewish communities were clustered. It may be that this woman did not creep in the back door of the house hoping to avoid the sentries before seeing Jesus. Perhaps she entered boldly, accustomed to her place of privilege. Yes, she longed for healing for her daughter. Yes, she sought help from Jesus, this healer whose reputation had preceded him. However, if she is from this upper class, she could assume a position of power over Jesus. After all, he is just a poor Jewish rabbi on her turf. She could walk right in, and maybe did so. Now, if you accept this interpretation, Jesus' sharp words to her would be understood quite differently. She is a person of power. Then it is possible that Jesus is confronting her unjust economic advantage with blunt words. Jesus could be saying, in effect, first, let the poor people in the Jewish areas be satisfied, for it is not good to take the poor people's food and throw it to these rich Gentiles in the cities, like you do. Now, scholar Polling Sun suggests that Jesus' initial offensive sounding words could be grasped as an act of resistance to yet one more appropriation of resources of the oppressed by the powerful. We can ask, is Jesus simply fighting back for the poor when he lashes out? If you accept this possibility that she was from an elite class, or even if you stick with the earlier version that she is an oppressed person, it does not alter the sheer audacity of her retort to Jesus. Either way, she spoke up boldly on behalf of her child and refused to accept the rebuff of Jesus. She was convinced that grace and mercy extended to her as well, and she was there to claim it. I would observe perhaps she should be one of the case studies in Hillary and Chelsea Clinton's book, Gutsy Women. When this tenacious mother comes back at Jesus with her clever response, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs," Jesus can only agree. Jesus concedes the argument and says, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." Jesus can only agree that God's love and healing power knows no ethnic, political, or social boundaries. Bottom line of story one, however we get there, God's love and healing know no boundaries. For the second healing story, Jesus is moving on again, this time to the region of Decapolis, also a Gentile region. Maybe he is still trying to find a place to rest, but again, escaping notice proves impossible. The text says, some people brought a man who could neither hear nor speak and asked Jesus to lay a healing hand on him. Like the Syrophoenician woman, this man is an outsider to the Jewish world, the Jewish community. He would also be cut off or rejected possibly from his own world because of his inability to hear and communicate with others. With no hesitation, Jesus responds to a desperate request, though he does take the man aside, away from the crowd. I'll not repeat the rather earthy process that Jesus uses. Suffice it to say that when Jesus uses the Aramaic word for be opened, the narrator tells us, and his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Suddenly, this man is able to hear and communicate with those around him. Not only is he physically healed, but he is also restored to his community. These two stories are especially appropriate when we consider where we are in our church here. Labor Day is past. We'll soon be beyond the Delaware County Fair and the Little Brown Jug. It's time to think more explicitly about our program year and beyond. What will be the focus of our congregation life and activity? Now, certainly, spiritual nourishment for the faithful through worship, study, and prayer is essential. We must have that healthy body within. But our congregational mission cannot end there. Like Jesus himself, he travels into Gentile lands. We, his disciples, are continually called to a larger vision of mission, one that aims to embrace the outsider, the stranger, maybe even the enemy. Now, here we sit today, people used to having a comfortable place at the table. Perhaps we need to be reminded that none of us has or can earn any particular right or privilege to claim with God. We all come as beggars to the table. We need to be reminded it is solely by God's grace that we are fed, and in gratitude for that grace, we can respond. Perhaps we also need to be reminded that God's table is immeasurably larger than we can imagine and infinitely expandable. Be reminded it is part of our job to bring people to that table. For those who self-identify or want to identify with the Syrophoenician woman, falling on our knees and begging for crumbs, it must be said that Jesus does not leave any of us in a state of beggarliness. For those like the man with no hearing or speech for whom others must advocate, it must be said that Jesus does not leave us as unhealed. He sits us all at the table and claims us as God's beloved children, children of every tribe and language and every ability at the table. We know that even the crumbs from the table would be enough for our healing and salvation. Jesus has given more than enough. He sets an abundant, well-giving feast for all. Ours is to, in gratitude, reach out to let all know that they are welcome at the table. May we be like those people in Mark when they said Jesus ordered them to tell no one. But the more he ordered them, the more zealous they proclaimed the good news. Let us be those proclaimers of the good news. Amen.